Good morning, everyone. Thank you for those that have signed on to attend this session as part of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week. My name is Jeff Overmars. I'm Communications Advisor at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists in just a moment. Just wanted to highlight the fact that this is, I think, our sixth event for Nova Scotia Human Rights Week so far, and there are plenty more to come. Encourage folks to check out the Human Rights Commission's website at humanrights.novascotia.ca to check out the list of forthcoming events. A number have been added since our first sort of communications push, so please do check in. There are lots of exciting opportunities to engage, and a reminder that these events are all being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards within 24 hours, I guarantee it. So please find those on the Commission's website as well. I will just start with acknowledging that we are gathered virtually here today for this session on Mi'kma'ki, or in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Mi'kmaq people have made this land their home since time immemorial, and they are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. The Commission recognizes Mi'kmaq teachings and wisdom such as Emsit Nugama, meaning all my relations, which highlights the inherent interconnectivity of all things and beings here in Mi'kma'ki. And it's our hope that by engaging in discussions across communities, we can help to advance equity and inclusion for all Nova Scotians. I also would like to acknowledge that African Nova Scotians have made Mi'kma'ki their home for more than 400 years. And in that time, African Nova Scotians have come together and fought for greater justice and inclusion for their communities and for all communities in Nova Scotia. I want to highlight too that the advocacy of African Nova Scotians and Black Nova Scotians led to the establishment of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission and the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. Without their advocacy, we would not be here, and we are building upon their legacies and are deeply grateful for all that they have done and continue to do to advance justice for all people in Nova Scotia. Today's presentation is Gender-Based Analysis Plus and Human Rights. Gender-Based Analysis, or GBA Plus, is a way of thinking and acting that helps us to understand how policies, programs, and services impact women, girls, and gender-diverse people. Representatives from the Nova Scotia Status of Women Office are here to share with us some highlights from their work with GBA Plus. I would like to introduce Josie McKinley, Executive Director, Shiva Norpana, Director of Programs and Outreach, and Leslie Poirier-McClurden, Program Administration Officer. And without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to you, Josie. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you to all of you who are joining today, and for the Human Rights Commission for having us. My name is Josie McKinney, and as Jeff said, and I am a Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey woman. My pronouns are she and her. I know Jeff did do the round of introductions, but while I pull up our deck, I'll just turn it over to my colleagues to do an introduction of themselves. Starting with Shiva.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our presentation today. My name is Shiva Nurpana. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm very happy to be with you today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Leslie Poirier-McClurden. I use she, her pronouns. I have medium-length brown hair, pale white skin, and tired blue eyes this morning. I use the pronoun she, her. I'm originally from Nova Scotia. I live in Cole Harbour and come from a small community actually in Cape Breton and have some Acadian and Scottish ancestry in my background. It's great to be with you today.
We're here to talk to you about some work that our office is doing around gender-based analysis plus and how it ties into human rights. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about what our office does and who we are as a team, just because I know it's not as familiar to the public and even some of folks in government. I'll just check in. Shiva, you can see the deck, correct?
Yeah.
Excellent. And I will say there'll be time. We've tried to build in some time for questions at the end using the Q&A function. So for those who don't know, the Status of Women office is an office of public servants that's attached to the Department of Community Services right now. And then there's also the Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And so the council and the office are separate, but related to each other and the work that we do. The Advisory Council is made up of volunteers, up to 12, and the volunteers are intended to reflect the diverse women and gender diverse folks in our province. And their role is to be an advisory to the minister responsible for the status of women. So ultimately, the vision of Status of Women and this both the office and the advisory council is gender equality in Nova Scotia. And the way we work to achieve this is by ensuring that women and girls and gender diverse folks are safe from gender-based violence by improving women's economic security and by encouraging women to participate in politics and in leadership roles. I do want to pause at this point and acknowledge that for our office, the work of the office, we want to say out loud, and it's important to say out loud that when we use the term women, we are talking about all women. We are talking about trans women. We are talking about Black women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, newcomer women. And we also, our office sees this as part of our mandate working with the broader gender diverse community, because gender equity isn't just about women's rights. It is also about the rights of folks outside our binary understanding of gender. And so we also want to recognize that that even as an office, as an organization, one of the pieces of work that's really important to us is moving beyond this concept of what a lot of people see as white feminism. So there is this long history of the feminist movement, I don't think intentionally, but excluding that broad range of the female experience and the gender diverse experience. And so our office recognizes there's a lot of work for us to do to pivot away from that, to overcome that and embrace the concept of intersectionality, which we'll be talking about a little bit more later. The office, I don't want to get into too much detail about the day-to-day, but just to give you a sense of some of the work that we do. So we have, three teams of three incredible teams of folks doing this work of the office. We have a programs and outreach team. So our office provides core funding to 20 women serving organizations and community organizations addressing gender-based violence. And then we also do grant funding to community-based organizations. So a big piece of what our programs and outreach team does is support those community-based organizations as they do their work. And then it's also really that this team in Status of Women is out there building new relationships with community, doing that sort of real deep connection, and tending to and maintaining those really important relationships of other people who are in this space doing this great work. Our strategic development team is all about trying to make sure that our work is aligned to not only just government mandates and priorities, but recommendations coming from key national and provincial public inquiries like the Mass Casualty Commission, the Desmond Fatality Inquiry, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls National Inquiry, the Nova Scotia's Restorative Inquiry into the Home for Colored Children. These inquiries are important because they were moments in time where people who were really vulnerable, made vulnerable by systems, took the time to share their trauma for the benefit of our learning, collective learning as a society. And so we feel very strongly that we need to answer those calls and we need to respond. And so our strategic development team really tries to align everything we do to that and then build connections across government. And then our policy and accountability team try to support everything we do with research and data, and really contributing this gendered intersectional lens to things like policy and legislation. So that just is like a really very brief overview about what we do, to kind of give you a sense of why are we even talking about gender-based analysis plus, what's the bigger context of the work that we do. So I'm now going to get my colleagues to kind of talk us through what gender-based analysis plus is and what we're doing about it, and why it's connected to human rights. So I'm going to ask Leslie and Shiva to tell you about what gender-based analysis plus is.
Thanks so much, Josie, for the question. If you could just go to the next slide, I'll just take a moment to touch on, a little bit about what gender-based analysis plus is. As mentioned in sort of the intro, we talk about gender-based analysis plus as both a way of thinking and building or deepening our understanding, and from that understanding, using that as a way to really guide our actions. It can really be helpful, as you can see on the slide, to work towards building more inclusive and equitable policy programs and services. GBA Plus really explores the who and the how of issues. We use questions like who is impacted by the issue and how are they impacted by that particular issue, and how can our initiatives, programs, policies, and services be designed to very specifically meet the needs of all who live in Nova Scotia. So think here about, sometimes we need tailored programs, policies, and approaches to meet that rich diversity of experiences we have across the province. It can be really helpful to improve programs, policies, and services. As I already probably mentioned, we can really deepen our understanding because there's a lot of harm in our communities, and GBA Plus can help us look at and unpack some of that harm so that we can better understand how to address it. It can be really helpful in our sort of role at the Status Women Office to improve outcomes for all, including all women and girls, that rich diversity of women and girls that live in our province, and all gender diverse people, and all who live in the province, actually. I just want to touch on, if you could go to the next slide, please, the plus side of gender-based analysis plus, and acknowledge a couple of the key concepts that I think Josie already touched on this morning. So this will just be very brief, but we use a very broad, inclusive definition when we're thinking about and using gender-based analysis plus. Gender is about the socially constructed roles and behaviors and expressions and identities that we all hold as girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. And you can see many of those identities on the screen in the colorful circles. So it's about the fact that we can, at the same time, have multiple identities, like, for example, our ability or disability, or race and ethnicity, or language, or a sexual orientation. And how those identities give us access to advantages and disadvantages, and often at the very same time. So it's about the distribution of power and the access to those resources. Now, just touching on intersectionality. This is a term that we use about people who can experience more than one form of oppression or privilege. So it's about those multiple identities that we all have, and at the same time, we can experience sort of multiple layers of disadvantages or oppressions, or multiple layers of privileges, which are oftentimes unearned. So I just wanted to shout out to Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the professor of law who came up with the term of intersectionality. And she used that term to talk about the multiple layers of both misogyny or sexism that she experienced and the anti-Black racism that she experienced. As an example and as a concept, that's where intersectionality came from. So I just wanted to hand it over. No, I have a couple more points before I'll hand it to you, Shiva. I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time. I already mentioned the plus part is quite important, and I talked about why. And I just wanted to, when we do GBA Plus, we talk about trust and courage. You know, some groups have experienced a lot of harm. They've experienced a lot of trauma, and we need to continue to hear and listen and reach out and build trust when we're doing this work. And also, it takes courage in doing GBA Plus because there's a lot of people who tell you that we don't have the data or we can't really build this understanding. And I'm here to say that we can do this. We don't necessarily have perfect data sets. We live in a small jurisdiction. And when you look at various intersectionalities, it's difficult to get, you know, perfect data, say, for example, from Statistics Canada or other data sources. But we have a lot of community wisdom and knowledge in our province. And we need to think about bringing together stories, lived experience, and multiple sources of information when we do this work. So I'll just share a small personal anecdote. I've been involved in thinking and learning and understanding about GBA Plus since I went off on my last maternity leave. And at that time, one of the barriers that a lot of people were talking about is, look, we're a small jurisdiction, we're a small province, we just can't really do GBA Plus here. And that was 11 years ago. My daughter just turned 11 on November 28th. So I'm here to say it is possible. We need to be a little bit brave and creative in doing this work because it can really make a difference. I feel really privileged to do this work, and I just am so excited to share it with you here today. So I think now I'll just pass it over to Shiva. You were going to just talk a little bit about intersectionalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, so with regards to intersectionality, you can see all these facets of identity that all of us bear to varying degrees. Intersectionality isn't a term that just applies to women or people from minoritized or racialized communities. All of us experience different facets of our identity and positionality, and these will exacerbate or conversely cause us to have privilege as we go through our lives and encounter various systems. And I did want to share some of my own experience. As I mentioned, I'm a first-generation immigrant. I'm from the country of Iran, a country that is quite notorious and open in its abuse of relations towards women. I don't have political safety in my own country. I don't go back. I don't have the access to the kinship network that I have there. I'm in Halifax. I have my 2 kids with me. I'm a single mom. I'm a lone parent. So these all affect how I experience, how my financial outcomes, my labor market outcomes. On the other hand, I'm aware that I'm very privileged. I have a Canadian passport, which is a huge privilege. I have education, I have health, I'm able to have a good job, and these are privileges which smooth my allow me to have better outcomes. So I'm very much aware that the sum of my experiences as a woman who is racialized, my children are racialized, these will affect how we respond with different systems. Like how my son, for example, would respond to police engagement would be different from how his white friend to how his friend who is African Nova Scotian respond with police engagement. And these are absolute real life experiences that have been part of my experience as a parent, as a mother, living for so many years in Halifax. And I just wanted to share that with you as a real life example. And I also wanted to return to the point that Leslie made about being courageous and being able to take action, because I know there's already a question about rural areas and how there isn't enough data in rural areas. And I wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate absolutely being rural versus urban is totally a marker of positionality and will impact access to services. And there, even if there isn't precise data on every different rural location in Nova Scotia, we know that. We already know, for example, that women in rural locations, and we're going to be talking about this a bit more, will experience intimate partner violence as a form of human rights violation very differently than the way they can access services, the lack of public transportation, and so on, than women in urban areas. And these are absolutely things that we need to be able to address and unpack. Thank you, Josie. Next slide.
Thank you both. Just before I go on the next slide, I do want to just add to that point, that last point, Shiva, is that, we're not here to say that data isn't important. It's essential. It's so
Absolutely,
important. And we know that in the investment in data, always there's a huge return on investment, but data can also, this requirement for data can sometimes become a barrier, a greater barrier for our most marginalized communities. It becomes cyclical, or an extension of the discrimination, in the sense of the people who hold the ability to collect and disseminate data are the ones in power. And if they do not collect it or disseminate it, and then turn to those communities and say, well, you need to give us the data, we're not going to collect or disseminate the data that we have, you can see that it becomes another additional barrier for those communities to face. And I think the other thing beyond what Leslie's point earlier around this whole idea of that there's other sources of data, other sources of information, and one of those great sources of information and data, particularly qualitative data, are those public commissions of inquiry. And so to repeatedly ask and survey marginalized communities, particularly Indigenous communities, when they have already very clearly said what they need, what their experiences are in multiple forms of national inquiries, it is incumbent upon us to make use of what is already out there, rather than repeatedly asking for more, because every time someone has to talk about their experiences, their oppression, they are re-traumatized. I think that's really important. So my second question that I put to Shiva and Leslie is, what is Status of Women itself doing about gender-based analysis plus?
Thank you so much, Josie, for the question. I'm just going to spend a few minutes just touching on before getting into what we're at, some of the points of gender-based analysis plus, some of the things that we're doing. I just want to touch lightly on, how important gender equality is for everybody. It really does benefit everyone. And we are making some progress. But if we think about it in our own lives, how really important it is from ourselves at our own individual level, in our families, as well as in our communities and our workplaces, and in the overall larger society, gender equality really matters to us in many ways. As I mentioned before, I think we are making some progress in areas like education. We're seeing the rollout of the National Child Care Program, and we're seeing some progress made in leadership. But at the same time, that some of that progress is a little bit uneven. We still have, just to the point of the earlier question about rural areas, we still know we have what's called childcare deserts in our rural areas, so not having access to very good childcare in many rural areas. And we know we need more diverse women and gender diverse people in leadership, and not only white women. We know that women, Indigenous, racialized, and gender diverse people are often not included in decision making or in leadership positions or in politics, and also not always in the workforce. And that women who face multiple layers of discrimination experience more barriers. And GBA Plus can really help us unpack that. So I just wanted to mention that we need to keep working when we're doing this work on gender equality and using our gender-based analysis lens. It makes me think about some of the sort of gaps that we still have. We know that there is still a gender wage gap in this province and across the country, and that means it's at 73 cents. So that means for every dollar earned by men, women earn 73 cents. And places like the World Economic Forum have identified that it can take 169 years if we keep going the way we're going to close that gap. And we know this gap is greater when we apply a GBA Plus and intersectionality lens to it. It's much greater for people who experience multiple barriers, gender diverse people, for women of color, people who are experiencing those multiple layers of discrimination and those intersectionalities experience a far greater wage gap. And we know as we grow older, we experience something called the feminization of poverty. So that means, as we grow older, we can grow into having a deeper experience of poverty. And that is greater for trans women and women with disabilities. And that wage gap that I mentioned earlier, we know from some of the research, actually it was Girl Guides of Canada, the wage gap can happen and start at in our youth when they have their first summer job. And another part that I want to mention about a gap is that Nova Scotia women's employment is really concentrated in the minimum wage sector. So that really is an area that we can continue to try to improve if we want to make improvements for gender equality overall. I just wanted to pass it over. Was there anything you wanted to add on to that in those comments or have any thoughts there, Shiva?
No, I'm good for.
Okay. Sorry, I'll just go to the next slide in terms of what we are doing now with GBA Plus services at Status of Women. Last year, we developed training on GBA Plus by working with the Department of Community Services. We worked with people who make policies, who develop laws, who design and deliver programs, as well as budgets. We also worked with an awesome graphic design company to develop images and visuals. You'll see some of those on the screen today in this presentation. And I just wanted to sort of shout out to the communications folks in this kind of work and how we illustrate and communicate about doing this kind of work. Sometimes we need to create new images because there really weren't any visuals that we felt were good enough to articulate some of the concepts we were trying to develop in this work. So in terms of the training itself, we developed and launched a half-day training with leaders, including directors, managers, financial officers, regional staff. We held 6 training sessions. One of those was virtual. We also did training. We piloted some training with another department, the Department of Labor, Skills and Immigration. And 87.5% of participants, we trained about 100 people, reported that GBA Plus training is really relevant to their work. So I just wanted to mention that. We did some sort of evaluation as we rolled this out. We're also working with other government employees who want to help Status of Women with GBA Plus by bringing it into their departments. So we're working on a train the trainer approach to GBA Plus with another department to try to grow the reach and depth of GBA Plus. And we also provide corporate supports by working with other government departments and agencies and projects who want to look at the issues, programs, policies that they're working on from a gender-based analysis plus perspective. So I'll now pass it to Shiva.
So Shiva, you're going to tackle our next question of why does GBA Plus matter to human rights, to our human rights?
Exactly. So the point that we really want to bring home at this juncture in our presentation, we've been talking a lot about GBA Plus, and now we want to talk specifically about gender-based violence, which is an understanding of violence where we apply a GBA Plus lens. And we really want to emphasize the point that gender-based violence is a violation of human rights. And this is where we most clearly see the intersection of the violence that individuals, women, girls experience because of their gender as a human rights violation. And I want to, in the National Action Plan Against Gender-Based Violence, which is developed by the federal government and implemented in our province by our Office Status of Women, gender-based violence is actually called one of the most pervasive, deadly, and deeply rooted human rights violations. So, what is actually gender-based violence? It's an umbrella term for violence based on gender norms and unequal power dynamics. It's perpetrated against someone based on their gender, gender expression, gender identity, or perceived gender. So it may be violence that somebody experiences, not even because of anything that they've consciously done, but just because of how they're perceived, or maybe rumors about them, about their gender. And that could be a form of gender-based violence. It takes many forms. It could be physical, but it could be much more than that. It could be economic, sexual, as well as emotional and psychological abuse. So it is a very insidious form of abuse. And many of these things that I've noted here, such as emotional abuse and so on, they can actually escalate and lead to much more extreme manifestations of violence against gender-based violence. For example, femicide, which would refer to when women and girls are gender diverse people are actually murdered because of their gender. Violence is disproportionately, all the statistics we have, and we're very much aware, as Josie reminded us earlier, that statistics are incomplete and there's a lot of underreporting. There's a lot of stigma around gender-based violence, which makes reporting quite difficult. But all the statistics that we do have indicate that violence is disproportionately experienced by women and girls, and it is rooted in gender inequality. Gender inequality is further intensified by other systemic inequalities, and that's where the connection with GBA Plus becomes quite apparent. So we have other systemic inequalities such as racism, the historic legacies of colonialism, ableism, classism, and social discriminating against people because of their socioeconomic status, poverty, and homophobia. And here's where the connection with human rights become very apparent, because all these different forms of systemic inequalities intersect with gender discrimination to create this, or exacerbate the vulnerability and exacerbate the risk of individuals, in particular women and girls, experiencing gender-based violence. Next slide, please.
So just before moving to that, I think just to put it in the simplest terms, gender-based violence means any type of violence that women and girls and gender diverse folks experience at disproportionate rates. So any type of violence that is more likely to be committed against a woman and more likely to be committed by a man. And so that's why it is violence like sexual violence, physical violence, violence in relationships, emotional violence, economic violence. Those are all forms of violence that are the vast majority of times committed against women and girls, and the vast majority of time committed by men and boys. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean that men and boys do not experience those types of violence. They do. And it does not mean that women do not perpetuate those types of violence. They do. It just means that it is overwhelmingly the other way around. So getting into, what this tie into human rights, one of the best places that does a really deep dive discussion about taking a human rights-based approach to gender-based violence is the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and 2S LGBTQIA individuals. I would think a lot of folks here would probably have heard about this national inquiry, but I will talk a little bit about it here because it is so foundational in understanding this idea of human rights and its connection to gender-based violence. But there are other inquiries that do talk about it, and recent ones in our own province. So the Mass Casualty Commission and the Desmond Fatality Inquiry here in Nova Scotia talk about gender-based violence. how pervasive it is in our society, and how it is very much the outcome of systemic failures, not just around systemic failures for women and girls, but all of those sort of intersecting identities that we've been talking about. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus inquiry, or MMIWG as it's sometimes called, was tasked, this national commission, to look at what is underlying from a social standpoint, economic, cultural, institutional, and historic standpoint, what is underlying the extremely high rates of violence towards Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQI plus people. So among women and girls, Indigenous women and girls have been made the most vulnerable and experience some of the highest rates of violence in our society. And it looked at what's going on in our systems right now that are supposed to address this, and why are those systems and those policies failing. The commission heard testimony from over 2,386 people. So those were mostly family members and survivors of gender-based violence. So over 1,400 of the testimonials came from folks, family members and survivors. 819 of the participants participated through artistic expression. And there were 83 experts, knowledge holders, and government officials who testified at the Commission of Inquiry. And at the end of the day, what the commission concluded was that the violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA plus people is genocide. It is a form of genocide. And it recommended taking a human rights-based approach to addressing that. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, first of all, recognizing that Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people are holders of inherent rights. Indigenous rights, constitutional rights, international and domestic human rights, and then for some rights under various treaties, land claims, and settlement agreements. So why is that important as to see them as rights holders? Well, it's important because it totally shifts your perspective and narrative. So instead of seeing Indigenous women and girls as victims, you're seeing them as rights holders, as independent rights holders. And when you are a right holder, you are entitled to certain things. It shifts the responsibility from you as a victim to highlight your oppression, and instead on the systems to recognize your rights. It means that those issues that are important to Indigenous women and girls are treated as a denial of rights rather than simply unfulfilled needs. It sees their exposure to violence as a systemic violation of the rights to gender equality and non-discrimination. So once you look at it like that, it requires broad structural changes instead of just seeing it as a symptom that requires temporary solutions. And its effectiveness and urgency, the response, how effective that responds and how urgent we respond to it, is not just a measure of the effectiveness of a program. It is suddenly a measure of your country's commitment to uphold and promote human rights and to meet its obligations on our international and national human rights conventions and declarations. So it completely shifts the narrative. The bottom here at the quote on your screen is from the commission, from the inquiry. It says, "The steps to end and redress this genocide must be no less monumental than the systems and actions that worked to maintain colonial violence for generations." So all of that generational, multi-centuries levels of violence and genocide cannot be addressed for anything less than something so as big as all of that. It requires that degree of response, which is why seeing it as a human rights-based violation is so important. This is what the commission speaks about. So the time, what does this have to do with Gender-Based Analysis Plus? Well, GBA Plus helps us to take this human rights-based approach because it is teaching us how to see that systemic violation of rights to gender equality and non-discrimination that leads to things like gender-based violence in our programs, in our services. So it helps us see those systems of oppression, those long-term structures that take into place that create these circumstances. It basically is a systemic response to a systemic issue. That's the only way to really get at eliminating something as massive as gender-based violence, is that you have to tackle the gender inequality that underpins it, that you have to tackle the colonialism, all of these other pieces, the systemic racism and discrimination that exists. That's the only way you eliminate something like gender-based violence. So I'll ask Shiva and Leslie to talk about what can you do in this work.
You want to go for it, Leslie?
Sorry, my mouse was just paused out a little bit. Yes, I'll go for it. I'll take the first crack at it. Thank you so much. So what can we do? What can we all do? So one of the ones that I want to talk about when I see this list on the screen, we might not get through them all, but the one I want to start with is think about and understand that and acknowledge the problem. You know, everybody, women, men, transgender folks, can be victims of gender-based violence. And Josie mentioned men too can be victims and of gender-based violence. So think about and acknowledge the problem. Deepen your understanding, if you will. Do you know the risks? You know, the odds of experience violence are not the same for everybody. While everybody can experience it, there are people like young women and girls, Indigenous women and girls, as Josie mentioned, people like who experience those multiple harms and intersectionalities, like Black, racialized women and girls, gender non-binary folks, 2S LGBTQI plus folks, women living in rural areas, and people living with disabilities are at a much greater risk of experiencing gender-based violence. I think another one that I'd like to talk about, well, I'm getting through them kind of quickly, is that stop victim blaming and shaming. We all kind of do it. Look for the victim blaming when you're looking at the media coverage. You know, unpack how the media is covering a particular experience that's being highlighted. Generally, victims won't report it because they feel shamed. They feel shamed by their families. They feel shame from their friends. And they also feel a great deal of shame from the perpetrator or their person that's using violence against them. So call that out. Think about gender-based violence not only from the physical side of things. Not all gender-based violence is physical. There's name calling, there's stalking, there's harassment, there's control, including financial. You know, how are people being controlled online through cyber attacks or, you know, through social media? There's manipulation that is happening that really are forms of gender-based violence. I think I'll do one more, Shiva, then I'll pass it over to you. Of as much as you can, learn more about and avoid gender stereotypes. Men and boys also suffer from unfair social expectations, like having to be the tough person or be the main breadwinner. We still see this in our society. Women can be CEOs, girls can be great things, men can cry, boys can like pink, just to name a few. But think about how we all live our lives and what the gender stereotypes are, and break them down. Pass it over to you, Shiva. I feel like I'm getting a little too excited here.
No, thank you, Leslie. Some other actions that are good to think about is engaging men and boys. And we recognize, we acknowledge that the majority of men and boys do not engage in violence against women, and they are actually needed as allies to help this kind of pervasive culture that we've been talking about. And certainly we're not promoting the idea that there's something inherently violent, that's absolute. But when we talk about education, when we talk about culture change, culture shift. Those are, and knowing that men and boys are really important in, and they can lead by example and reject violent behaviors towards women, girls, non-binary people, and they need to be willing to speak out whenever they see such violence or harassment directed at them. At Status of Women, for example, we are very proactive in supporting community organizations to develop and deliver educational programs for boys and male-identified youth, which exactly engage with these issues, with toxic masculinity, with healthy relationships, boundaries, consent. And we recognize absolutely the important role of men and boys in this work. I also want to encourage you to support local organizations and shelters. Across Nova Scotia, there are several what are in Nova Scotia are known as transition houses, which offer shelter. There are women's centers. There's a variety of supports and the supports programs in place for women and children who are in unsafe situations and need to be somewhere safe. And we encourage you to learn about them, to support them when they can. Many of them hold public events. Many of them have great websites with all sorts of resources on them. So we definitely encourage you to learn about what's happening in your local community to support victims of abuse. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie and the next slide for the last piece of content, almost.
Thank you so much, Shiva. I just wanted to recognize that we are in the midst of the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And you'll see on your screen, this is a visual that's shared with us from the federal government, where this is really the 16 days of action, or an annual sort of public awareness and action campaign. And this year's theme is Come Together and Act Now. So today is December 5th as part of those days of activism. I want to acknowledge that on the 25th of November, those days began, and that is the day for eliminating violence against women. And on December 10th, when these 16 days end, that is Human Rights Day. And these days really do highlight that violence against women, getting back to our theme and our topic today, that these days are about recognizing and calling out that violence against women is the most pervasive breach, really, of human rights. Tomorrow is December 6th. That is the National Day of Action, of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. And tomorrow is a day that remembers. It's kind of a somber day, almost a bit of a sacred day, to think about people who we've lost, people who live with gender-based violence. And it's also a day to think about and honor those people in our lives, in our own families, and to take action. You know, December 6th, this day began in 1989 when an armed man killed 14 women and injured 13 others at École Polytechnique in Montreal. It's still really incomprehensible to really imagine, you know, that this did happen some 35 years ago, where these women were killed by an armed man simply because they were feminists, because they were women. So what can you do about that? Well, this day is recognized in many ways across our country and across Nova Scotia. There are often other ways that you can participate in public events. Sometimes some of those events are televised. Sometimes they happen in our own communities. I know, for example, there's one happening in Halifax, Sydney. Mount St. Vincent University usually has one. The engineering school in Halifax often has one as well. So just sort of wanting to call out the chance for you to dig deeper and learn more about this problem, and also participate with community who recognize this day at the events happening across Nova Scotia. I think I'll hand it back to Josie to wrap us up. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie and Shiva. And if you want to learn more, you can contact us, including about some of those events. So we have social media accounts on Facebook and X, and so you can follow us there. And we often repost some of the events that are happening in community. We do have a website as well. I will say our website is we're currently behind the scenes looking to launch a new website. But there is still tons of really great resources out there. So I'll stop sharing now. But I do see some questions here in the Q&A. Shiva sort of already answered one around the rural areas, but I do see one Q&A around says Bill C-332 proposes to criminalize coercive control in domestic relationships in an attempt to stop gender-based violence. Critics say policing response won't work to solve the issue of gender-based violence, and resources should be directed to social services to support victims instead. What would GBA Plus suggest on this issue? So it's a really great question. And it is true that there is a bill underway to criminalize coercive control. And for folks who do not know, coercive control is really sort of a pattern of behavior that's, in a way of exercising control. And it, again, is typically done toward women, and it's usually not done in isolation. There can be other forms of violence in the mix, but it can be things like, controlling someone's finances, managing where they come and go, using emotional manipulation to get a person to do what they want. And we often see it a part of things like human trafficking, and domestic violence, and those sorts of things. And so what I think gender-based analysis plus would do is it's not that it would necessarily answer that specific question, but it would help us think about a process, the best process possible to approach that very question. Some of the steps around GBA Plus talk about who's framing up this issue, who's part of the conversation, what are we trying to solve here, who's not a part of the conversation, what do we already know, what research and data is out there that is available to help us answer that, what are the barriers, what are the what are the risks, those sorts of things. It's really helps us to sit down and think about an issue from a lot of different angles. And this is certainly one of them. And I would say across the sector, around the gender-based violence sector, there is ongoing conversations about the importance of moving to prevention of violence rather than waiting for systems to respond. Doing both, you need both, but how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place? And gender-based analysis plus is a great tool to help us answer that question as well. So I know that that's not a precise answer, but I think this is, one of these challenges of these complex issues like this is really making sure that we are approaching it as well as possible. I see someone else also asking about litigants using coercive control to weaponize children. And that's also another form of coercive control, is using things like family court systems or family court processes as a way of controlling a person. So coercive control can take a lot of different forms. It's a super complex issue. So it will be, be interesting to see what comes of that bill. But again, that gender-based analysis plus is a really great tool to help us unpack these complex issues. Happy to answer any other questions that folks might have. But ultimately, we really do appreciate the time that we've had and the ability to meet, to be here today and to participate in this work. Any other points that you would add, Shiva or Leslie?
No, I mean, I think that really captured it all. GBA Plus isn't, it's not going to give simple yes or no question answers on these are absolutely complicated issues which require complicated answers, multifaceted answers, and GBA Plus is a great tool for us to see where those answers can be. Like criminalization, is it going to take in place in conjunction with education, with community consultations, with bringing in, like, there's a lot in each of in these issues, and this is a great lens for us to approach it in this very human-centered, rights-based manner.
And another comment I see there in the chat is just the need to take into account of all genders and identities, and it's absolutely true. My background is in criminal prosecutions and human trafficking prosecutions specifically, and we know that the more as society we marginalize certain communities, that puts them at risk for gender-based violence, and the transgendered community and gender diverse community in particular. That what the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry talks about is that the more in society we devalue a group of people, the more vulnerable we are making them to violence, and that is definitely what's happening to the transgendered community, who in the work of human trafficking, experts in this province see them being targeted for things like human trafficking, because as a society we undervalue them. And it's the same thing with Indigenous people, particularly in Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian women and girls. And so when, as a society, you say that certain people are not as valuable as others, then for those who would inflict violence, those are the folks that they're going to target, because they're counting on us not to care. And so that's why this work and this week is so important, because it really highlights the need to care, and beyond care, to act. And as bringing it back to what Leslie said at the beginning, it does take courage to do this work. It absolutely does. It's centuries work. It is work that each of us in our time will only be able to move the needle so far, or hold the line of progress. But that is good work. That is essential work. And then it is the work that has been done by the people who came before us. And so, on that note, just again, thank the organizers for having us, and for all of you for attending and showing up for this work.
Thank you.
I see that question about GBA Plus training. I just wanted to note that there's a training module on women and gender equality website that is available to public it's a 6-hour training module on GBA Plus. It is at a national level. And if you go on the website for Women and Gender Equality, the federal department that works on women and gender issues, you'll be able to access that training.
And we are, just because we are in the middle of updating our website, we don't have our training yet available on our site, but it will eventually be, contents of that will be on there. But as Shiva said, Women and Gender Equality Canada does have sites already available.
Thank you, Josie, Shiva, and Leslie, for this excellent presentation, and for taking the time to share your important work with us today. Thank you also for mentioning the 16 days of action, and as well tomorrow's Day of Action Against Violence. I just wanted to highlight that Nova Scotia Human Rights Week was proclaimed to include December the 6th intentionally to highlight this issue. And so we are hosting a webinar tomorrow, gender-based violence prevention for newcomers, refugees, and migrants. And that's taking place online as well between, I want to say, 2 and 3:30 tomorrow. Folks are able to register online for that still. And next week, we've also got a session that we're hosting with Youth Project around anti-trans violence and policies in Canada and regionally. And so both connected into this subject, and certainly so many great resources that you've highlighted, and would encourage folks to please take advantage of those. And thank you for giving some concrete, tangible actions and steps that folks can take as individuals to help move the needle. And again, hold the line, sadly, resonates these days. And so we are all called to act on this issue. And so thank you again so much, everyone. The recording for this session will be made available on the Commission's website within 24 hours. I really hope that folks will find it and share it and save it. And thanks very much again to each of you for sharing this with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.